My name is Dave Musil. I'm the current chapter president for the Idaho chapter of the Wildlife Society. We've started a new schedule so that we don't have to be in the hot seat for 2 years in a row. So next year will be Don Kemner, and we have the elections. Make sure that you choose your elections, because that vice president will end up becoming president-elect, and then president, and then past president. So it's good that we have a couple of choices there, so make sure that you do your ballots. Bathrooms. Out to the hallway, to your right, all the way down the hall. First major hall to your left. You don't want to go through the doors, the glass doors, but there's bathrooms over there. So first major hall on your left. Cell phones. If you can look at your cell phone right now, put it on vibrate or turn it off. Guilty as charged. I'm going to turn mine off. Everybody that I need to talk to is right here. So if you can do that, it's just a lot nicer for our speakers not to hear your little rappy jingle that can be annoying at times. I think we are pretty much all here. I want to welcome you to our annual meeting. I think we are at the 43rd conference of the Idaho chapter of the Wildlife Society. We put a lot of work into the conference this year. I want to, if we can see maybe Don Kemner, if you know Don Kemner, he is the president-elect. Shane right here is the vice president. Most of the planning really was done by Shane. So, Shane. When it came to the local organizing the hotel, Jim Hayden, our past president, I'm not sure where Jim went to, and Laura Wolf, our treasurer. You saw Laura outside. And then also our secretary, Sandy. I was going to ask her if it's Vistine or Vistine, but I never remember. She is our secretary, Vistine Condor, out there. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our plenary session. And in order to sort of get us somewhat in the same mode, I thought it was important to, what the heck is science? When we're talking about trying to strengthen the public trust in science, it's always good to have a little bit of an idea of what does Webster say about science. It's a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. The next one that I really like is science is knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding. Whoops, did I go too far? There it is. Sorry about that. Or did it go automatically? Okay, I'm afraid that I might have actually had recorded it, so it might be going to hit on itself. So our whole idea is to look at the public view of science and their sometimes mistrust in it. My impetus for having this as a discussion topic was several years ago. I was invited to be a expert on sage grouse biology at a local working group, and so I gave my typical sage grouse 101 biology class, and after I was done, I went through the basic biology of sage grouse and all of the management guidelines, and I sat down. The gentleman stands up, very polite. He says, "Yeah, that's all good, but you can say anything you want with science. You can say anything you want with statistics." In other words, he was telling me I was lying. Being nice about it, but yeah, you're just lying about how important sagebrush is for sage grouse. Well, that little splinter has been in my mind for quite a while, and I thought, well, let's look about that. Why do the general public, our constituents, hunters and fishermen, anybody else, why do they distrust science so much? And what sort of even brought it even to more to a poignant talk or a poignant topic is what was going on in Nevada. And in Nevada, they went through and had some changes in their directorship. And this is a quote from Ken Mayer, the former director of the Nevada Division of Wildlife. He says, as the director of a state wildlife agency, you try to do the right thing and base things on science. You're going to have your detractors. So we have to accept that as always a possibility. And another quote in that same article, this is from the chairman of the Nevada Board of Commissioners. Science-based management is the highest priority of the governor, and I have no doubt that whoever Ken's replacement is will be science-based. That's good to know. That's kind of nice to have that as a base to know that science is important in a statewide management level. And then you have your detractors. Cliff Gardner, a rancher from Ruby Valley, Nevada, was quoted as saying, I'm sure most of the people being considered for this job graduated from a college. These people are the cause of the destruction of wildlife. Possibly some of that was taken out of context. Maybe he didn't mean to be that sharp, but it kind of gets to the point of the public distrusting science. And then more recently was a quote, and I got this off of our YouTube, of Commissioner Randy Budge, our current commissioner here in the Fish and Game. I really liked what he said. He said, a lot of the decisions that we make are based upon, I would say, 2 parts biology and 1 part sociology. Science is always the guiding light in trying to make decisions relative to management of wildlife, and I think that comes first and foremost. That made me feel really good to hear something like that. So with that, we've got a panel of speakers today. We've invited them to come to help us understand how we can get a better trust, back and forth trust with the public. I probably should have had a definition of trust, but I think it is that if you can tell the truth is the main thing, and people accept that you're telling the truth, that's somewhat of trust. So we have a panel of speakers. First, just to run down the line of speakers, and then I'll do a little bit more introduction on each one. First will be Dr. John Freemuth from Boise State University, Nancy Hadley, former commissioner from Idaho Department of Fish and Game, Bert Stevenson, a House of Representatives from the legislature of the state of Idaho, Jim Caswell. Jim, you've been in so many different positions, it's hard to really pinpoint how to actually describe where what would be the best, but he's been in the natural resources field for quite a number of years. And last but not least is Dr. Troy Hall from the University of Idaho. So first up will be, oh my goodness, messed things up already, is Dr. John Freemuth, and he's a professor of political science at Boise State University. What caught my eye for wanting him as a speaker was his foreword in the Studies in Avian Biology book that we have on sage-grouse ecology. He wrote an excellent article on the role of science in public policy making, and he's also been he's chaired the Science Advisory Board of the Bureau of Land Management. He's been a high school teacher, park ranger at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, and I'm really looking forward to his view of the human aspect of, human resources aspect of the human dimension of strengthening science. Dr. Freeman.
So I gather we're here to help you. Hold on to your wallets. Anybody's here to help you do anything. But so I'm in a discipline, right, that's so secure about this question of science that we put it in our name, political science, making us then, I think, appear to people anyway that what we do is scientific. Well, it may be, but the point is it shows you how much sort of in the academic world, this science thing is important enough that some of us in the social sciences have to assert that that's sort of who we are. Probably an overarching way to kind of frame where I'm going to go here is a quote that actually, for a time I was a senior fellow at the Andrus Center for Public Policy, and we did, I think it's one of our conferences on public lands, and Cease actually said during the conference, talking about best science, that best science is the science that shows me where I wanted to go anyway, okay? And I'm going to sort of elaborate on that theme now as we go through the day talking about this. Now, we were asked to consider a couple of things, and I'm just going to tell you what they were because hopefully we won't be politicians and answer the questions we wanted to answer rather than the ones we were asked to answer. But, so why do people distrust scientific information? Do we have any examples where the public were skeptical of science and were then turned around? Is distrust of science restricted to the Western U.S., and by that I think it means maybe the U.S. generally, or is it a worldwide phenomenon? Is distrust of science more prevalent in the natural resource field, or are all branches of science held suspect by the general public? And then probably the most interesting one for everybody, what can wildlife biologists do to bridge the gap of distrust? So I tried to organize a couple of thoughts around that to see where we might take it. So, why do people distrust scientific information? Well, I don't know if they distrust the information necessarily, or it's how it's used more than anything else. I think that becomes the interesting question. And look at everything swirling around climate change. All right? It's not the information necessarily that people distrust, it's the people who use it for various purposes that creates all the brouhaha. I think if you haven't seen it, there's a really neat web page called climatedebatedaily.com, and it's just, you know, your web page, right down the middle is a line. One side has all the opinions, the science, the so forth. From the we need to do something point of view, it's real. The other side is the skeptics, okay? And you can go and I have my students often just do an exercise where I have a look at both sides and form their own opinion, all right? And to me, it would be kind of interesting if we could do that in a lot of areas of public policy where anybody interested could go out there and try to sort through everything. But to me, it's what gets that people so polarized about it, and I think most people probably, and I'm no expert in this, have noticed something that's different. We hear all the war stories or the apocryphal stories about things people that have noticed that are different. The place I used to be a ranger may not be there much longer if Lake Powell keeps going down like it's going down. The Park Service just had to cut a new channel to get the boats through where Antelope Island is. People notice things like that, but then when it's moved to, and therefore we ought to do X, that's what gets people going, because now you're talking about impinging on everything from their lifestyles to their values, all right? And often, a side point of that is sometimes the people prescribing the changes look like they're living pretty well. It's the Al Gore problem, right? The guy lives pretty well. We need to change our lifestyle. Well, gee, Al, you got a pretty good one yourself, all right? And that's what gets people going. The issue is not now about the information, it's the how it's getting used in the social realm, all right? And then we go, you know, a corollary of that might be, so is it science we're concerned about or scientists and how they behave or don't behave or talk or speak or act, all right? Now, so I'm going to read you a little bit of quote here because my bias, and I think I said it in the Sage Grouse piece, and I've seen it lots of other places, is you always want to try to at least assert your biases up front. Political science is a huge bias. It's that democracy is good. Right? Now, I don't think I could empirically show that to you. Maybe I could come up with measures that democracies generally have higher standards of living and so forth, but we kind of assume that democracy is a good thing somewhere way back in our how we approach what we're doing and so forth, all right? And you know how you'd react, of course, if I, as a political scientist, went and said, well, gee, you know what, I have a PhD in this, I've written books, I know more than you do, shouldn't my vote count more than yours? You wouldn't like that, would you? And you'd have every reason not to like that assertion, because my voting really doesn't have to do with my study of politics as a scientist. It has to do with my own set of values. But who said this? This is kind of interesting, and maybe since it's in this thing, some people actually read it. What I fear, therefore, is a government of experts. God forbid that in a democratic country we should resign the task and give the government over to experts. What are we for if we are to be scientifically taken care of by a small group of gentlemen who are the only men who understand the job? Because if we don't understand the job, then we are not a free people. We ought to resign our free institutions and go to school to somebody and find out what it is we are about. Guy who said that's a PhD. Guy who said that was President of the United States. The only president to ever have a PhD, and God forbid it was in political science of all disciplines. Don't think we'll ever elect another one of those, but it was Woodrow Wilson said that. Okay? Kind of an interesting rumination that there's someone, and granted back then, I'm not sure what a PhD in political science was compared to what it is today, but nonetheless, he throws out this caution about expertise and science and so forth. So that then leads us to what is science. And there is a bunch of debate over the whole thing. In fact, there's a whole new sort of subfield of something. It's probably everything from sociology to anthropology, a little economics and political science, the study of science and technology, trying to look at this. And this should probably make everyone feel better, this field developed because of the importance of science within public policy conversations, all right? And so there's a lot of people talking about what, they get into then pretty subtle questions of what is science. I thought about it in two simplistic ways anyway, but to kind of get at, excuse me, some of the points I'm talking about, science is certainly a process, all right? The scientific method, as it were, all right? It's a set of procedures designed to get somewhere regarding the production of certain information that can be verified or validated or re-looked at to see if it's accurate and so forth and so on. The problem there is attacking that or looking at that first is that sometimes that isn't done the way people think it ought to be done. All right, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bob Lackey. He's a professor of fisheries, worked for the EPA at Oregon State, and he brought up this, and he's written a lot in this area, but recently on a web page of his at Oregon State, and I can get people the reference later, he simply asked this question. He's been writing about this a lot, and he cautions everybody about what he calls normative science, all right? And he kind of summarized his article, and here it is, it's on their online page called Terra Magazine. And he just throws out this notion that he's getting really worried that increasingly there are more and more scientists that are acting as normative scientists. In other words, they're not simply just providing neutral information, they're either providing what he and others would say is pre-chosen hypotheses to do certain research to get where they wanted to go anyway, all right? And then they back up and say, well, no, this is just science talking, all right? And Bob throws out this a short version of his piece saying we shouldn't be doing this. And it's full of interesting comments then on the webpage about people reacting to this, all right? But what he's essentially saying is if the scientific method, the science's process thing, gets violated by pre-chosen hypotheses and so forth and so on, then we're all in trouble as scientists. And I actually use in this sage-grouse piece that Dave mentioned, something that happened in the Journal of Conservation Biology, and yeah, I read that. I mean, let's face it, I don't understand some of what's going on in there, but because it helps my thinking. I mean, I'm glad I was a full professor because my colleagues kind of went, so you were published in the Journal of Avian Biology? Well, that has nothing to do with political science. I actually had that happen to me when I was coming up for tenure. I published in the Journal of Forestry, and one of my colleagues got something in a knot, and, well, is that even refereed? And actually, Dean John Hendy at the U of I actually wrote a little note down saying, actually, yeah, it is, and it's pretty heavily read by lots of people, so we kind of think that was a good journal to be in from our perspective. And that just shows you sort of the academic narrowness of where sometimes we get in all of this business and so forth. But anyway, in that conservation biology piece was the notion that there was a great debate among conservation biologists because a fairly prominent one, and I don't think it was Michael Soule, it was somebody at that level, had suggested that we need to reform grazing. And a bunch of other conservation biologists said, whoa, hold on here. We can't a priori start with the premise that we need to reform grazing. We essentially need to assume a null hypothesis that grazing has no effect on inherent biodiversity, and then go do the research and see indeed whether it does or doesn't, and then talk about what needs to be done. And they suggested, our research suggests that sometimes grazing actually is helpful to biodiversity. All right, and so all of that is a round-the-house way of saying science is a process, and boy, it better be followed well. And if one does go into it at the beginning, say, you know, I really like sage grouse, then you say that at the beginning. You assert your assumptions, your values, and so forth. You still have to do the science correctly, but I think people would relax a little bit, and I think most people understand still that people that go into wildlife biology and associated disciplines have some interest in those things in a positive way, all right? But nonetheless, sometimes we don't assert our own assumptions and values as we go into these things and so forth. The second thing, and this is what gets to some of the other questions, is science is also a way of knowing the world. You've all seen the great brouhaha, right? When somebody wants to insert creationism in a biology class, where it does not belong. You could have a class in a school, a high school, a college. In fact, we used to have some of these. I went to a small liberal arts college where I actually had to take things like comparative religion, right? Well, you could certainly have a philosophy class of ways of knowing the world. And you could talk about science, and you could talk about religion, and, you know, Planet X, if you wanted to go into conspiracy theory as a way to know the world, because there's a lot of those people out there, and they're increasing, unfortunately. All right? But anyway, the point would be, that's how you could talk about this and have people, and granted, we all know how difficult it would be to teach a class like that without all sorts of crazy things going on. But that's how you would look at that question. You wouldn't try to shove creationism into a biology class, because as far as I know, creationism doesn't follow the scientific method in any way, shape, or form. But that's what makes so many of our debates so tense, is because there are people who have other ways of knowing the world that are more important to them than science as a way of knowing the world. No suggestion that they are right or wrong, but their whole worldview comes from someplace else, all right? And so if they feel, if you kind of go back to the beginning question about science and how it's used, they get nervous if they think that deep value questions are being ignored by the use of science as a trump card, all right? Well, science says, and take a real controversial one, science says life begins at birth. Is that going to end the debate? There's a fellow at Boulder that thinks about this stuff a lot, Roger Pelkey. He's written a lot about science and the role of science and so forth, and he calls that kind of stuff, well, he uses a specific word, that's abortion politics. That is not going to get refereed and solved by invocations of science. Where a, quote, set of worldviews there gets completely, feels like it's being ignored because people are trying to use science to end what is a horribly tense, sometimes vicious, emotional debate over a serious public policy question. All right, now there are obviously other things that can be much more influenced by science, which leads to the question of, so what's the deal in the natural resources field? All right, well, obviously there, as you guys all well know, because there is so much value, uses, and so forth wrapped around natural resource issues, science, and this is pretty obvious, I think now, is science becomes necessary but insufficient to resolve those questions, unless you want to put scientists in charge. All right, and whether that's good or bad, I won't even suggest, but I know we have not decided to do that yet. All right, and so science becomes useful in the debates to inform people, but it doesn't end them. All right, without it, then, and because of the laws and everything else wrapped around endangered species and many other issues, science becomes part of trying to resolve the issue, but because everything else swirls around it, then it alone can't possibly, I think, resolve those kinds of issues. I kind of got to be in the middle of one of these things once. About 15 years ago, we decided, I was talking to Jay Gore, who was in the Fish and Wildlife, and we said, let's put a wolf question in our annual public policy survey, just to see. Okay, and I am not one to suggest that we make public policy by opinion polls. Because after all, this is true as far as I know, the British were once surveyed about whether they thought they had a higher probability of being abducted by aliens or hit by lightning. Yes, aliens came in higher. So sometimes when we talk about listening to the public, I get that. I get that, oh my God. You know, I was a ranger, I got asked dumb visitor questions, like which side of the damn Lake Powell was on. I was actually asked that. We have another name for these people, we call them voters. Right? So, I mean, you can understand anymore that an ill-informed public or a misinformed public ain't gonna be of any help whatsoever in those kinds of things. But when we asked the wolf question, I was blown away when it came back. 70% of Idahoans favored having wolves in roadless areas of central Idaho. Now we asked on that one twice more, and it's been too long since we asked on it again, and every time though, if it was an election, wolves win, though it dropped, okay? When that answer came out, I did call Jay, I did call Larry Craig's office, I did call the Forest Service and said, you're not gonna believe this, but this is the result, and it was all scientifically, it was all scientifically done, random sample, appropriate size, margin of error and so forth. That blew everybody away, because what those things can do is they can put, it's science, again, if you think an opinion poll is done scientifically, it puts that into the equation versus everybody speaking for Idahoans. Well, Idahoans don't like wolves. Well, maybe they don't, but how do you know that? All right? And we actually thought that, okay, we didn't think any way, shape, or form that wolves would show up at that high percentage, but they did. All right? And that went, I'm not suggesting that somehow changed the debate, but it did put pause, right or wrong or different, in 15 years down the road about whether or not what Idahoans really felt about that. Okay, and to me, I think it's sort of like, at least I think it's true, except for the real crazies out there who will name nameless, that people that work in wildlife, I still think, and I don't have any survey data to back it up, fall into the same category as people, park ranger type people. There's a general sense that people who are out there working for wildlife do it because they care, and there is, I think, a respect for that. And in the basic sense of the American public, to do it better comes to talking about transparency and sort of the great, admitting your passions and what you care about, understanding that science cannot on its own resolve these difficult questions, that they're policy questions where everybody has a role. And yes, wildlife biologists as citizens have this equal role to anyone else in a debate. It's just what they cannot do is say, well, the science therefore says that this ought to be the public policy solution. No, it doesn't. Science can never do that on its own, but it can inform it. And anyone has an active role as a citizen expressing their concerns. And you can certainly say, yeah, I study it a lot, and this is what I think we ought to be doing, but I'm not suggesting that science is saying we ought to do that. I think we ought to do that. All right, these are my values and preferences. Yes, they're informed, but I'm not trying to trump other people's values by playing a science card. It's much like somebody playing a religion card. There was a thing in the Coeur d'Alene paper today, America's a Christian nation. It was a guy's opinion piece. And I looked at it, and there were, of course, references to various quotes of the founders and so forth, but anybody who kind of studies that part of American political science, political theory, goes back and looks at exactly what Jefferson and Washington and Madison and what they all actually said, and really tries to sort out what they meant in that context. But again, you read that and you wonder, well, what is the real implication of saying something like America's a Christian nation? Are you talking about how you treat each other, or you've got to be a Christian to be an American? Which I think we would all recoil at. It's sort of the same thing about people saying, well, the science is in, therefore, we need to do X. All right, so, that's sort of where all this study of the role of science has gotten to. And then, sure, there are questions where without science, we don't do anything. When John F. Kennedy said, go to the moon, we didn't have a debate on which crater to land on, right? Between interest groups. We sort of let the scientists and engineers figure that one out on their own. They didn't get to say, no, we ought to go to the moon. They probably thought it was cool, it was jobs, it was new engineering challenges, all of that sort of thing, but the decision to go to the moon was made by a president and Congress. Then they figured out the best way to get there. All right, and we could then debate about whether we ought to go there. We didn't really get into a lot of debates about how to do it among people who didn't know anything about that. Do you think I should be a few more minutes? Now, the questions will come later, right? Okay, so that's kind of how I look at all of this. And in the piece I wrote on the sage-grouse, I just try to kick all that around a little bit. Because, and I don't know where we get it all. I don't know, and I think it's maybe increasingly because of the power of science in all of these societal debates. But I'll leave you with a little quotation from the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Albert Teich, who actually directs the science and policy programs. And I think it's sort of what a lot of people are sort of saying. I think if one understands it, then it becomes a lot easier to move ahead on questions everyone cares so passionately about. But the dominant mode of scientists engaging with the lay public in the past has been public understanding of science, an approach based on the belief that if people only knew more about science, they would see the world the way scientists do. This is a paternalistic posture, one that is based on a failure to recognize the legitimacy of people's values when they conflict with those of the scientist. The constituencies whose values are reflected in some of the political positions of the administration, which, and this is the second Bush administration that's being referenced there, with which many scientists disagree, are not necessarily uneducated or irrational. Rather, they have a different perspective on these issues, one that places a different value on the costs and risks versus the benefits of stem cell research, reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, or the preservation of a species of aquatic plant that may block construction of a dam. They need to be engaged in genuine two-way conversation, a dialogue, rather than dismissed out of hand or educated. One of the things that always makes me nervous is when someone says, well, the public needs to be educated. And the inference is always, I'm gonna be up here doing the educating and you're gonna be educated. And it always seems to be a one-way dialogue, rather than, okay, here's what concerns me, but I need to hear back. This is where we've seen this whole development now, sort of various names for it, local science, indigenous knowledge, information that comes into a difficult public policy issue, but it's just not the research scientist educating, but listening to other perspectives, views, and indeed information about an area or so forth that helps make a better decision. To a political side, it's a power move when somebody says X needs to be educated. It sort of implies that I have the answer and you need to listen to me and then have my answer. Now, it may turn out that I do have a good answer, but that doesn't get discovered by a one-way conversation. It gets discovered by people talking to each other and so forth and so on. And I was talking to Mike Scott a little bit at the beginning because I've gotten to know Mike and we've done one or two things together, all this science, public policy business. But to me, the real issue, and then I think I'll close, and it goes back to the beginning, it's not science, it's how certain people grab onto it. And then our idiot friends in the media, who are not very scientific, and indeed aren't very much of anything sometimes, the way they tell a story is just ridiculous, all right? And then they quote people who want to use science for various purposes. And many times research on scientists say most scientists get really frustrated by that. They're not necessarily the ones out there advocating for policy X. Now, some are, and that's a problem. Every time Paul Ehrlich opens his mouth, I get nervous because he's made so many astounding predictions as a scientist, like, I'll lay even odds that Great Britain won't be a country by the year 2000. Tell that to the Queen, right? I mean, he says that, and media just pick it up because the media don't have very good science education, do they? And this is a side point, but it's really important. I don't know why we don't reward good science communicators more than we do. Okay? Why do we like people like Carl Sagan so much? All right? Because they can communicate these things that, boy, I don't understand current theories of the universe. Maybe you do, but if they can explain it to me at the 6th grade level, I think it's amazing. Yet we don't necessarily reward people for good communication of science in a way that gets a dialogue going. Get rewarded for publishing in a journal, that's great. But the big issues are as much about education and communication as they are publishing in a journal. I get more comments on crazy blogs that I write on rather than academic journals I write in. I get more stuff done by throwing something out on a blog than I do writing in a journal that 8 people read. All of them just like me. That doesn't necessarily do much, okay? So that's kind of I always leave, and I remember it was the Big Fish and Game family meeting, not this one, it was a few years ago, and my oldest son had gone to the deal with salmon that they do in Boise for the 4th graders, I think, where they get to do all this stuff on the river and do all these fun things with fish and learn things. And I thought, how marvelous this is, right? And then when I was done talking about whatever I was talking about, the women who ran that program for Fish and Game came up, and they were almost in tears because they say, what we do never gets any attention in this agency. All right, but if you want to see that kind of education having an effect on school kids, and don't we all know that we're worried about our kids aren't going outside anymore? Like you did, that's why you got into this, right? I assume, those kinds of experiences when you were young. It's that kind of thing that may underlie all of it at the end, is people who have a passion that can communicate difficult issues in a way people can understand them. All right? And yet we don't reward that. To me, like we should, on difficult questions where science is wrapped up in these issues. Someone who can communicate the science in a way people can understand it and have a dialogue, they ought to be rewarded for that. We ought to, students that are interested in that sort of thing ought to be encouraged to pursue it, because those may be the boundary spanners or the bridgers that allow things to go forward. All right, so I think I'll stop there. It's about right. And look forward to the other comments from our panelists and then your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker is Nancy Hadley. She's a certified financial planner with over 30 years of experience in accounting and finance. Sandpoint native, past president of the Sandpoint Rotary Club, treasurer of the Bonner General Hospital Foundation, and she serves on the local chapter of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. More importantly for us is the amount of years that she put in as the Fish and Game Commissioner here in the Panhandle region from 1997 through 2005. Nancy.
Okay, I just kind of took my bio off of my work bio, so I kind of apologize for that. I should have had paddle fishing and elk hunting and all those other exciting things. And then for my time on my commission, they called me a couple days ahead. Well, where's your PowerPoint presentation, and we'll load that for you. Well, I should know you guys like PowerPoint presentations. And of course I didn't think to have one. So Dave graciously has volunteered to keep you guys awake with shadow puppets of bull moose while I'm up here talking. So if I get too boring up here, Dave, you step in and really help me. I'm going to, since we're being recorded, I just want to say my main disclosure statement here so I don't get myself into trouble, is that everything I'm going to say is strictly my own opinion, so just take it for what it's worth. Don't add anything to it and get me into trouble. What I wanted to do, as talking about public trust and the strength of trust, is kind of let you know that trust is part of life. It certainly affects me in my industry, it affects you in your jobs, it affects me in my relationship with my family and my husband. Trust is a real key thing. And so I'm going to kind of talk about trust in a real broad sense. What is trust? How do you build it? Some of those basic rules that no matter what you do, that trust kind of goes across. So the first thing that I'm going to do, so that it's not, I don't want to put you guys defensively, is I'm going to kind of pick on me and my industry. So that you can see the point, and then I'll maybe try to bring it around to how it would affect you and what you do. In the financial industry, it's really popular to want to be the trusted advisor. Do you want to give your money to anybody that you don't trust? Well, that would make sense. So we all try to portray ourselves as the trusted advisor. Well, I have, it's just awesome that I get to share my profession with people like Bernie Madoff. Isn't he trustworthy? Or how about that Wiley insurance agent that lives down the street in a checkered jacket that drives a really nice car? And, you go in to see him about your insurance policy, and he's going to sell you an annuity, because those things are the best things since sliced bread, and it will cure and solve any problem in the whole world. And there's a 10% commission on that, by the way, which pays for his new car. But it is exactly what you need and why you should give him $100,000 or $500,000 so you can get a nice commission. Is every insurance agent that way? Is every financial advisor a Bernie Madoff? Absolutely not. No, not even close. But those things do surface to the top, You know, that's kind of what you remember. Those names are going to stick in your head. And I'm going to have to fight through that to kind of get trust built up in me and in what I do. So you kind of have to keep that all in mind, that people have a perception about, you know, different industries, different people, and you have to get through that. One of the things, my public speaking experience is I've been a hunter education instructor for 25 years. So that's kind of my background here, is teaching 12 to 17-year-old, primarily male groups of kids. So, you know, I'm a real good speaker. If I just pretend like all you guys are 12 years old, I'm great up here. And one of the questions, because I'm teaching ethics and responsibilities for hunters, is what these 12 to 17-year-olds are going to do out in the woods is going to affect the public perception of me as a hunter. And it, you know, certainly is going to have a role in what hunting is down the line. So I'm trying to teach them that as they go out in the field, they need to be responsible, ethical, and that their actions are going to reflect on hunters as a whole. So I asked my class of 12 to 17-year-olds what their opinion of a male teenage driver is. And I let everyone in the classroom answer. I ask everyone, and I get, you know, certainly answers like reckless, they drive too fast, they're always trying to show off. Several things. You know, are all teenage male drivers that way? Absolutely not. Very small percentage of them, but they all get that label. And so what we want to try to do is avoid the label that we all get. And I think that that is part of the problem that wildlife biologists have, is that you guys get the label. And sometimes you don't even recognize that there is a label there. So again, just trying to kind of broaden that out. So how would you get the label? We were talking about sage grouse, and when I was practicing last night, that kind of came up. I remember, you know, a meeting on the commission that an environmental group had done a sage grouse presentation the night before a meeting, and a couple people had gone to that. And at the meeting, the environmental group that was doing this presentation, they had an audience of, you know, environmental minded people, and they kind of outright said, you know, we really don't care about the science and what's going on here, we just want to stop grazing. And, you know, there were people from the community that were in there that heard that. Well, you know what? That is what's said in people's minds. So now when you go up and give a great sage grouse presentation on 101 biology, you know, it's still in their minds that biologists are just trying to stop grazing, whether you said it or not. So we all get that label. I have a dim memory, and I didn't go back and try to substantiate this story because I'm not a scientist, I don't have to do that. But you know, when I was on the commission towards the end of the time I was there, my dim memory, there's kind of this thing swirling around that some biologists, an article came out in the paper that when they were working on the wolf reintroduction, they did a study in Yellowstone, and before they reintroduced wolves. And there was some manipulation of the data a little bit. You know, they were trying to further the reintroduction effort. And so when they were studying the effect of wolves on elk, they maybe manipulated the data a little bit. Where there were active wolf packs in Yellowstone, the calf survival went way, way down. You know, single digits, low teens. Where there were no wolves, the calf population was, you know, high 20s, 30s, you know, which kind of makes sense. So they just kind of averaged all those numbers together and came out with some data that said, you know what, wolves in Yellowstone really had very low impact because the numbers only dropped a very small percentage. The ungulate population in Yellowstone is still in the high 20s. So elk are going to be able to survive. You know, the conclusion is that, you know, there really isn't, wolves don't have an effect. I don't know if that's true or not, I just remember that. So again, you know, I don't care, you know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I don't even know who did this study. But everybody gets labeled when that kind of thing comes out. That's what I remember. And it's really easy to remember the bad and not the good. So you kind of have to understand that that's where people are thinking and coming from. You know, the average person doesn't differentiate between agencies, so, and they don't differentiate between, you know, an environmental wildlife biologist, you know, that works for an environmental group, or one that works for an industry group. You know, you all kind of have the same, you know, the same badge on. For that matter, they don't differentiate between a wildlife biologist, a fisheries biologist, a habitat biologist, or a conservation officer that wears that Idaho Fish and Game logo. So you are really judged by your peers, and it's a large group of peers. So, just kind of be aware of that, it's more than just who you are and what you do. It's a very broad group that kind of, that creates that. A second point, and John brought it up a little bit, is if I had come up here after that wonderful introduction, and I brought a couple staff members from the company I work for, and they kind of flanked the room and started handing out my business cards and my brochures to each and every one of you as I got up here to talk to you guys about this public trust thing. Wouldn't you feel like maybe I was trying to sell you something? It wouldn't be a very good feeling, would it? What is going on here? Well, sometimes, if I'm listening to that sage-grouse presentation from the environmental side, I expect it to be really tilted towards their point of view. I know that when I walk out of there, they want me to believe whatever message that they came in for. So you need to be very much aware of that and try not to have a tilted presentation, try not to make people feel like they're being sold something, that you actually are just giving them good information. Make sure that it's broad-based information. I really like the point that, let them know what the right side thinks. Let them know what the industry side thinks over here, and then let them know what the environmental side thinks, what their point of view is, what their take on, and then kind of fill in that with a broad middle section, that science. Here are, some relevant points. Regardless of that, we understand these are out there. That way, it makes people and allows people to kind of come up with their own conclusions and give a little bit more trust to you. Another way to get trust is by referral. Referral is a really important thing. As in the example before is if I'm trying to sell you something or I'm that wily insurance agent. If you go into your accountant that you have been working with for the last 10 or 20 years to get your taxes done, and you always have a business planning strategy, you guys all own a business, and that CPA is looking at your taxes and how you did last year, and he says, you know what, he said, I really want you to consider meeting with Nancy Hadley because she really has a specialty in managing retirement plans, and I think we can work together on a tax strategy that's going to save you a lot of money. Why don't you give her a call and set up a meeting? Do you think that person's going to call up and set up that meeting? Is he going to have some trust in me right from the get-go versus me handing out a card and a brochure and saying, hey, give me a call, I know I can help you no matter what you need? So that's trust by referral. I had a really good referral. I've been working with the CPA for several years. He knows what I can do. And so what I want you to do is think about how you can get referrals. When I was an outgoing commissioner, I sat down with the incoming commissioner and I let him know a couple people that I truly trusted in the department. These people have always been honest with me. I think that they are the best, whatever they are, in the whole state. I know, you guys know Sharon Kiefer. She's now, an assistant deputy director. Her presentations, the style that she presented, we never felt like we were being sold. She was always very factual. Her presentation style, I gave that referral. I gave her a couple referrals for some of the people in our regional office here. These are guys that are the best in the state. Don't lose them, treat them with respect. On the flip side, I also gave a couple referrals for people that I really didn't trust. These people weren't always honest with me. I had some issues, somebody who wasn't honest in the community that they lived in. They had another agenda and they were working on it. There might have been some conflicts of interest. I have conflicts of interest too. You always want to disclose those up front. Make sure that people are aware that there is that conflict of interest issue and try to step away from it and behind it. So, if you're going to build trust, you need to be totally honest up front and certainly kind of watch that. But again, the referral source can get you a long ways, a referral or an introduction. So if you're going to be speaking to a working group, find out exactly what they want. Find out, from the community, can someone introduce you to the group that you know really well that also has rapport with that group? And all of a sudden you might be elevated a little bit in that. Because the best compliment that I can get is, I work with Nancy Hadley, I really trust her. That's how you kind of build up your reputation and you build that trust. It's not easy and it takes a long time. So there's just not, one silver bullet that's going to build trust. Another thing that you want to do, and again, I'm an accountant, so of course I like numbers. You guys are scientists. You guys like words, or at least a lot of you. And everybody in the room had a button, and they had a guy up there, again, it was financial terms, but they had liberals and conservatives in the room. They had, kind of both sectors of society. And the guy was up there talking, and, all the liberals would push the button. They really liked the presentation. They changed the presentation. The conservatives would push the button. They really liked it. But they were really only getting about 30% of the room that thought that was a good presentation, that they really trusted this guy. They changed some of the wording. They changed the words that they used. And all of a sudden, it kind of brought it both all together, and they got like a 70 to 75% acceptance rate for the same message, just in different terms. So I'm not sure how you do that study and find those terms, but certainly maybe try a broader audience when you're practicing your presentations. Kind of what I came up with when I came back, I wrote down some of the key terms. I work with you to create a long-term financial strategy designed around your desired lifestyle, instead of, my other one. Well, what that means to me is, hey, my desired lifestyle is I want to go fishing in Alaska every summer, I want to go on a moose hunt, and I want to spend a month in Mexico. Okay, I can feel that. It's not all those, financial objectives, disciplined, integrated. So kind of watch your message. I think Brad, you were probably there. I was sitting in on a presentation that the commission was going to get the next day, and so they were practicing, and I'm not sure why they let me in the room, but that was cool. They gave me a cold beer. And they're going over this presentation, and it's a predator prey presentation, and they're talking about lagomorphs, which of course you all know are rabbits, hares, and pikas. I had no clue what a lagomorph was. So it was on like the first or second slide, and I'm trying to think, lagomorph. And it's on 2 or 3 more slides. What the heck was a lagomorph again? I mean, actually I had to ask them, because if we were in a room, I could do that. And I thought, if that presentation had gone in front of the commission, I'm going to be focusing on what I don't know, or that word I didn't understand, instead of kind of the main point that they were trying to get to. But, they all went to college and they learned these fancy words, and, that's you guys have to use those. So again, just kind of think about how you phrase things to the specific audience that you're going to be talking to. So again, I saw a lot of different things, in a lot of different arenas on the 8 years I served on the commission. I saw people that were so passionate about the animals that they were managing, one person in particular. And I couldn't trust anything he said, because that passion and that emotion was just all over him. So he was so emotional, he wanted us to believe like he did, and to just go down that one path. It wasn't scientific, objective, any of those things. So you really have to kind of watch that a little bit. I also was told that, it's your job just to kind of sit up here and rubber stamp what we do, because we're experts at what we do. Well, from those of you that know me very well, I don't rubber stamp anything. I don't care which direction I get, who tells me. My husband certainly has learned that he's not going to tell me what to do. From the political arena, I certainly got some advice. They didn't, if you're going to tell me what to do, you better tell me why and what reasoning, so that I can make a decision. Because if you tell me what to do, I'm going to back off and do the exact opposite thing. That's just who I am. Not everybody's built like me, but I'm pretty independent. I like to be the one making the decisions, and I like to make the decision based on as much information as I can get from as many different sources, so that I can look at the very broadest picture instead of just a little piece of the pie. You know, a tough thing that you guys need to do is you need to go out and let other people know, whether it's in your department or, you know, in your industry, that their actions are reflecting on your reputation and credibility. You know, certainly for the company that I work for, if I saw unethical activity, you know, I'm going to call them on that because, you know, what they do reflects on me, and that's in any industry, you know, across the board. You have an extremely tough job. I mean, I don't want your job, believe me. You have to build up trust, you know, with a bunch of different sectors, industry sectors, environmental industry, your peers in the community. And while building up trust with one section, I mean, maybe by giving a real broad approach, you're going to alienate, you know, a peer group somewhere along the line. That might not be good. I remember one time, and I know that this is hard to believe, but Boise had this idea on statewide management that liked everything to be the same. And, you know, so it comes up to North Idaho, and, you know, we're just a state of mind up here. We're about as far away from Boise as you can get. And, you know, it made it real tough, you know, trying to give me enough information to help me make this statewide objective decision, and that's not what I wanted to do, not what I wanted to hear. So, you know, all of a sudden, you're making management mad. You know, gosh, I'm not able to convince Nancy that this is going to happen. Well, you know, where's he going to get his next promotion? Where's he going to get his next pay raise? What's his review going to look like? You know, so you guys are really up against it, you know, and trying to build this credibility and trust, you have to decide which is the most important. And then try to weigh it all out and walk that very thin line and let other people know that, you know, I'm walking this line. This is my top priority, is that I want people to trust me, believe me, and it might not always be the most popular. So that kind of is what I wanted to go over, you know, is to let you know that it takes a long time to build trust. It can be broken pretty quickly, so that it's each an individual effort and a group effort. Thank you.
Nancy, I'd like your business card. Our next speaker is Bert Stevenson. Bert has quite a background of representing people of the state of Idaho in many aspects, both on local to county level, and also as a state representative in the House of Representatives. And in that capacity, he was the chairman of the Natural Resources and Conservation Committee. When I was looking for somebody that could represent the political aspect of strengthening science for the public, sent in an email to Don Kemner and said, Don, what do you think about Bert Stevenson? And he said, well, let me walk down the hall. That means he's going to talk to the big guys. Walk down the hall. And I thought, well, that's going to take a while because nothing ever happens very fast in Boise, and I'm sure I'll get back from him maybe next week. Oh, about 40 minutes later, I get an email, go for it, he's great. So from that point on, I was like, okay, maybe Bert's not your typical politician, that he has a good reputation with us as an agency, but also in the general public for being 8 terms as a representative for his 2 counties, Jerome and Minidoka. So with that, I'd like to have Bert come up and help us out.
I'm always a little worried when they give that kind of a recommendation, and then I stand up, and when I'm through, they say, boy, how'd that guy manage to stay there that long? He doesn't know anything. And that may be. I, like Nancy, would like to offer a disclaimer. These are my opinions and mine only, and we can, I guess what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is, Nancy's done an excellent job on trust, but I can tell you that trust is magnified when you're in the legislature. Now, this group right from here over represents those who have registered to vote. From about right here this way, didn't bother. And then from that aisle there the other way was all that went to vote. And they voted me in. And yet, I'm supposed to be your representative, and I'm supposed to care about everything that affects each one of your individual lives. And so it becomes a kind of a balancing act that we work with when we're in the legislature. The other thing that I'll promise you, that perception is reality. It makes absolutely no difference what I stand for or what I do. If I perceive to be on one side or the other, then that's where I'm relegated to that position. Trust as a legislature is something that you build up over time. And that's basically all I have as a legislator, is the trust of those who vote for me. Jerome and Minidoka County, kind of small counties compared to Ada, Canyon County, Bonneville. And so, do I just represent that small group of people in Jerome and Minidoka County? I can tell you they're the salt of the earth. John, I'm not disparaging you people who live in Ada County. But they're the salt of the earth. And why are they the salt of the earth? Because probably 50% of them I know personally. And that's how credibility on a legislator or a scientist is based upon that personal relationship that you have with people. Now you say, well, how do I build that personal relationship? When I come down to Boise and come into the resource committee to testify, I don't have time to build that relationship. But the very things that Nancy talked about are the very things that come across very quickly. The other thing you need to realize is that there are 18 people in the resource committee on the House. Not all of them will show up to a meeting. And of those 18, there's probably 3 or 4 of them worried about how they're going to get a piece of legislation tomorrow in the State Affairs Committee, and so their mind is wrapped around that issue. And so you have to be able to touch them in a way that they will understand it. And sometimes that requires that information coming to them more than just that day of the hearing. We often talk about with the new capital, the way we have it. How many people here do we have that's from Idaho? We all from Idaho? We in Idaho are so proud of the 2 wings now that we have on the Capitol. Is Jim Caswell will remember when he used to come to the State Affairs, or to the Resource Committee, and couldn't even get within 20 or 30 feet of the door, and then you were expected to testify. And so with the new Capitol, the new wings on our Capitol, people can come in and sit down, and we have the ability to have all kinds of PowerPoints and those kind of things. PowerPoints are a wonderful thing if they're relevant to what we're doing. But so often, we get into so much detail with the PowerPoint that it's really difficult to do it. Probably one of the most effective PowerPoints I've seen had to do with the sage grouse and the Murphy complex fire that we had there in southwestern Idaho. And the thing that happened is the individual that came in and made that PowerPoint presentation only had probably 4 or 5 slides, but there was so difference in what they were showing of the effects of the fire, what burned and what hadn't burned, and the next 6 slides showed the recovery of that and what had happened before that. Everyone on that committee understood that fires burn different ways. Everyone understood that grazing had an effect prior to the fire as much as it had an effect after the fire. And so these are kind of things. Now, when you come to the science part of it, sagebrush takes an awfully long time to recover. If you want to know really how old I am, my father used to burn sagebrush when they cleared the Minidoka project. That was in 1907, so we've had a real love for sagebrush and kept the family warm for a lot of winters. And we did appreciate that. I'm not sure. Well, we used to like to hunt sage-grouse, and so that was the neat thing. Dave and I had talked a little bit about the pheasant recovery in Jerome and Minidoka County. But there's a couple of things you need to remember, that every time I go home from a legislative session, I get a call from somebody that has an issue that he wants to take care of. Now, in the sportsman issue, I didn't get drawn. Nothing to do with the science or the biology, unless we get more critters in the field. But that's one of the questions that I'm asked. How do I get drawn for the next hunt? In my particular area, how do we get the pheasants back here? Well, it's pretty easy for me to understand why the pheasants are gone. We who are tillers of the soil decided that we were going to till everything right up to the road. We were going to take out all of those ditches and drains, and we were going to put sprinklers on, and we'd solve that problem. And we're going to blame our neighbors who were raising fox that turned them loose, and it's the fox that caused the demise of the pheasants. Well, for you who are scientists would have to explain to us that that probably wasn't exactly what happened. When we took the habitat away, then we eliminated those opportunities. But don't tell me that I'm the cause without giving me an understanding of why we caused it. Now, are we going to go back to where it was? Probably not, because it's impossible to do it. We may have some opportunities in some other areas to regenerate some habitat, but I can tell you when alfalfa hay is selling for $250 a ton, you're not going to get the farmer out there to delay his harvest a little bit so that the aphid can live a little longer, so the baby pheasants have got something to eat, isn't going to happen. And so those are some of the things that we have to be careful about is when we work with these people, remember that the legislature is getting a message from home, what he wants. Remember that scientific information that comes has to come and be fed a spoonful at a time, rather than bring I remember one committee meeting, for those of you who remember Cameron Wheeler, he was chairman of the Resource Committee. We come in and got a thick book about this, all the scientific data. I can tell you that when that committee meeting was over, they went in and put them on their desk and probably got thumbed through a little bit. If you have scientific data, a conclusion or a summary is probably the best way to present it, rather than all the data if you're presenting it to the legislature, because if somebody's interested, they'll follow up on that and get the information. But I can tell you it's difficult, the volumes of literature that we have to go through. We have been fortunate in working with the Fish and Game Department in some of the things that we have been able to accomplish by cooperation. And the same applies to legislators, because a lot of the things that I think if this slick spot pepper grass would look like we were going to get that listed, by the producers and the agencies working together, they were able to avoid that. And that cooperation is an important thing, but sometimes it's easy to back away because it doesn't seem like it fits my needs. Now, when I say mine, I'm talking about the general public out there. These are some things that's pretty important. Short is better than long on reports and everything. Journals don't have a lot of bearing when you're talking to legislators, because that journal does not get read. It's put up on the shelf, and that's where it stays. Think of, if you could for a few minutes, the number of bills that a legislator looks at during a particular session. They were up to, I think the last I looked 2 or 3 days ago, they were up to about 289. It'll probably be somewhere close to 300. Everybody will be required to vote on it if you have a little bit of knowledge. You depend a lot on the committees that bring that information to the body. But there's a tremendous amount of information that has to be read and digested. Now, some of us have an interest in one field, and other legislators have interest in other fields, and this makes a tremendous difference on that. But think about that when you're trying to get your legislator to give some consideration to something that you presented. It has to be concise and important for him. Nancy brought a tremendous example. Speak in terms of we as legislators understand. This is kind of important to us. When you're talking about terms that I've never heard, I think of some of in the Ag Committee, they bring in some the scientific names on a report. And what are we talking about? Oh, that's Canadian thistle. I understand Canadian thistle. Pegweed, I understand that. But those scientific names, we don't always make the connection. And that's something that it's probably our fault as much as yours, but let me tell you, it's easy to discard that and let it go. The other thing that Nancy talked about is this credibility. If I, as a legislator, tell you a lie or don't live up to something that I've promised, then my credibility is gone. But the same thing is in reverse. If somebody tells me that, well, I think oftentimes the wolf deal, and Jim will maybe talk a little more about that, but I can tell you that that's probably, in my 16 years in the legislature, one of the most contentious issues for the full length of that 16 years. And why? Because people felt like they were put in here unwanted. We'll go back to the 20s and 30s. If you want to know why people got rid of the wolves, it was to preserve their livelihood. Well, does it make our livelihoods better if you're a sheep rancher and you find some wolves in the middle of that? If you have any questions about that, talk to Jeff Sidaway. He'll give you his feelings in a hurry. But when you come into a committee and say, we've got to have these wolves, you've immediately turned off 90% of those members of that committee, simply because their neighbors have told them we don't want them. Because I like to go hunting elk in the Selway, and there won't be any elk there if you dump the wolves in there. Now, science doesn't have anything to do with it. absolutely nothing. It's that mindset that we got rid of them because they killed our sheep. We don't lead them back because they're gonna kill our sheep and our elk and deer. And the science is, pretty much bears out that where the wolves are, the ungulates population gets considerably smaller. I guess probably would be better if you ask the questions that you want about what you think of your legislators. In conclusion, probably the thing I would suggest that you might want to do is get acquainted with your legislators. Let him know of those things that are important to you. Build that relationship so that when he calls you up, because I can tell you there's never been I can remember I got a call one day from a man and he hated Fish and Game. And I'm not sure that his reasoning wasn't that his neighbor had accused him of shooting ducks out of season. The enforcement officers for Fish and Game had gone to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor said, well, better go look at his freezer. They went out and looked at his freezer, and he didn't have any ducks. But I can tell you that man to this day, whenever he sees me on the street, he thinks that I let him down as his legislator because we didn't prosecute some enforcement officers for coming in his home and going through his freezer. I don't know that I did anything wrong. I checked it out. County prosecutor had told the enforcement officers that that's what they needed to do. But that's will remain in that man's eye forever. And as a legislator, I feel a little bit sorry for him because he wasn't home and they knocked on the door and the kids were there and they presented him with a paper, they would go through that. I'm not sure that that's how you or I would want that carried out, but that's the way it was. And so that attitude will never change. I guess in conclusion, when we talk about trust, all we have to do is think of Washington, D.C. and our legislators there. Bring that home to our legislators in Idaho legislature and take it down to the county commissioners and the city councils. We have a system that is a perfect system, but we have imperfect people. We get tangled up sometimes in those things that really hinder us being able to accomplish what we want. Now, I will tell you today that we'd be in really bad shape if we didn't have scientists to prove those things that should be. But in conclusion, let me remind you one thing. Be really careful when you become an advocate versus a scientist. And I'll give you an example. The third year I was in the legislature, we were really hot into the biological opinions for the Columbia River and the sand. And then across that desk came a paper with the signatures, I think, of about 7 or 8 or maybe even more. And part of them Fish and Game biologists telling us that the dams had to come out. Well, I can tell you that when that came across there, it didn't matter anything about science. Science did not make a difference because they were advocating to taking the lower Columbia or the lower Snake River dams out, which meant they were going to come right up and up the river and take all of the dams out, and the Snake River would be a free-flowing river. You've heard the story. Probably wasn't going to happen. But that particular day took us quite a long time to rebuild the trust of Fish and Game because those people's names were on that piece of paper advocating it. So if you're going to advocate, be really careful that you're following the guidelines of the organization that you belong to, and that you do it in a way that doesn't you don't lose your credibility. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave, and Dave has to live down there with me, so all you gotta do is lean on him to do better next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Bert. I'll still have lunch with you. Our next speaker is Jim Caswell. Jim's been in the natural resources management field for 41 years, working with Bonneville Power Administration, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service. He's been a forest supervisor at Clearwater, Targhee National Forest. Worked in the Governor's Office of Species Conservation. He was the 16th director of the BLM. And so Jim has quite a breadth of background in dealing with science in the natural resource field. Jim.
Thank you, Dave. It's really great to be here today and be asked, by the way, to attend and speak at this conference. I see a lot of old friends out there, folks I've worked with, which really was a privilege throughout my career to do that, and it's really great to be up here with these folks. And they, there's some real pearls here that's already been cast out there that I hope you take up. One thing I need to tell you right up front, I'm not a scientist, and I'm a resource manager. I've always thought of myself that way. I couldn't do your job. I use your information. I always use your information. I tried to make good decisions and good policy with science as the background and the backdrop. But it was only one of a myriad of criteria that go into both decision-making and policy development. And I think that there's a story, I think, that really does a great job of casting the difference between, or the contrast at least, between scientists and resource managers. And so I want to relate that to you, and I think you'll get the understanding. Before I do that, I have to get ready. Back in my day, the resource folks in my day had lots of names, some of which you can't really repeat in polite company. But internal to the agency, and mostly BLM really, one of the favorite terms is knuckle dragger. So we reviewed as the boys that went, and it was boys then, by the way, that went to the field every day and turned those nice pretty trees into stumps. And we were known as knuckle draggers. And so this is the story that I think really does a great job of the contrast idea between scientists and knuckle draggers. So there was this community, and it was, needed some help in terms of economics, and so they hit on this idea to build a zoo. And they figured if they could do that, it would draw in all kinds of folks, and all the economic activity that would ensue from that, and the community would be a lot better off. And so they were trying to figure out, well, how are we going to build this? We got all the money we need, we got the land, we just need a concept. And how are we going to put this together? And so they decided on a panel that they would set up a competition, and then they'd pick the best design. So they asked a group of scientists if they would put together a design, and then they asked a group of resource managers if they would do the same thing. And so these folks got together, and the scientists, of course, had a great breadth of different kinds of disciplines, ecologists, and biologists, and all the different brands of biologists so that they could really do a nice job of designing this thing and making a presentation to the judges that were going to make the final decision. Resource managers got together and they just grabbed a bunch of folks, and they decided, okay, we can do this too. Well, when they got done with their designs, the scientists came to the judges and they had this great display, PowerPoints, and display boards, and all this thing was very well done, landscaping, great habitats for each critter. Each critter had a scientific name, explanation of their population, how they were faring around the world, lists of what the criteria was in terms of their habitat requirements, their life cycle, all that well laid out, nice display boards, within the cages. When they got to the resource manager's presentation, they came in, they had these cages kind of built out of 2x4s and a few pipes sticking up and down, some fencing, and some wires, some razor wire around the top on most of the pits, because they kept them in pits. And then on the display was the common name, badger, followed by a recipe. There's the difference between scientists and their approach and research managers. And like everyone else, I was asked to speak to some questions, and I will attempt to do that. Questions like, what are the pitfalls that scientists run into in the course of their work? What happens when they're not believed or their particular conclusions aren't used? What do they do about that? How do they deal with the frustration? How can they overcome the frustration? Should they be an advocate? Can they remain objective as an advocate? So those are some of the questions. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about that. And I did some research too. And you're really not doing all that bad in a general sense with the public. The latest survey I could find on this topic said that 2/3 of Americans hold scientists and engineers in very high regard. Flip side of that was that 85% of the scientists and engineers said that the public ignorance of science was a real problem, and I would agree with that. I would accept the fact that that's true. Now, here's where maybe things start to kind of fray at the edges a little bit. In that scientists decried the poor coverage by the press, and that's been mentioned already this morning, and I agree with that as well. I mean, the press does a terrible job of covering science and what it means or doesn't mean. And maybe more importantly, though, only 3% of scientists indicated that they often engage with the press. 3%. It's a fairly broad-based survey, and I can give you the stats on who did it and when and all that if you're interested. And that's a telling conclusion in my mind about the issue of strengthening that relationship between the public and the science. So it looks like, at least from this one study, or the most recent survey, that scientists are held in fairly high regard by the public, but that doesn't necessarily mean the public has trust in the outcome of the work. The conclusions that are drawn from that scientific effort or work, or the cause and effect on their particular interests, and the conclusions that are trying to be, and the effects that are trying, people are trying to use against or with that particular set of interests. So the more I thought about this, the more I thought, well, how could you deal with those frustrations? And, what could you do to enhance the credibility of your work and respond positively to the public and broaden the base of acceptance? I mean, what can you really do about all that? And some of that, again, has been spoken to by the other presenters so far. And one of the things that I coined this as leadership, and I think that is one of the key things, is no matter what your role is in your organization, you can make a significant difference by becoming a more effective leader. It's not new. I mean, you've heard this before. You've heard about all the gurus of the day that talk about leadership and all the characteristics. Some again has been referenced this morning: respect, communications, ethics, accountability, listening skills, credibility, persistence, patience. I mean, all those skills that you've heard about or been in training sessions and so forth, they're all important. There's about 3 things that I really want to kind of hone in on this morning, and I believe they have really important aspects to the question, and they will help you as an individual in your work broaden that base, deal with your own internal frustrations, figure out a better or different way to approach an outcome. The job is not done just when you publish your final report and it's peer reviewed. You got to think about, how do you sell it? It's like the guy on TV that sells the OxyClean. I mean, you got to think about it that way. And what is the message? And again, other people have talked about this already today in various ways. And before we go on to the 2 principal criteria or characteristics of leadership, I think there's another thing that's important. This is more of a concept, and it's really a key concept. I think it can affect the long-term success of your organization, whether that's the department or a federal agency. I think it can affect, if you're a program manager and you've got a particular research project that's ongoing right now, I think it can affect the outcome of that long-term. Definitely affects the trust of the public and what trust they have in your work. And it may even influence your very survival. And I don't mean survival personally, but I mean survival in terms of your work unit, or the work you're doing, or the project you're working on, particularly if it's a long-term project. And again, this has already been mentioned, but it's the public and political support that you have or don't have. And acquiring that is just dependent on being an effective leader. In the private sector, organizations rise and fall based on profit and loss. They have to produce a product that their customers want, that they're willing to buy, and that will generate a profit that the company can continue to exist and be in existence. So fundamentally, in the private sector, it's a performance-based business. No big revelation there. Well, in the government, the closest thing that we have to a profit and loss kind of a statement is your public and political support. It's that bank balance that you have on the political and the public side. And your best indicator of how you're doing is your budget, or your funding level. If you're, again, you've got your own little group of folks that are working on some project that's kind of independently funded of the organization you belong to. Now, if you're running a profit and your constituents like what you're doing, the price is right, they'll want more. And your funding, and your budget level will go rise over time. So on the other hand, you're running a deficit. They're not happy with what you're doing. Or the price is too high for the product you're producing. Or it's going on and on and on and on, and you haven't produced a real product yet. They're not going to want what you have to offer. And your funding level will decline over time. The budget's going to drop. So in that context, you can think about the government as performance-based as well. And it's a lot tougher and more complicated system in government than it is in private industry. There's a lot more distortions, many distortions about that funding level and being able to support those budget levels. And we're certainly today all living in uncertain times by the dysfunction that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, the national level. And to some degree that carries down into the state level. There's so many unanswered questions about budgets and the future of the discretionary side of the federal budget in particular, and the unintended consequences that we haven't even begun to realize what those are yet. That today, as we speak right now, it's never been more important for you to step up and keep your eye on the ball. To act and behave in a way that builds that public trust and confidence and the political support for your organization and your programs. And Chairman Stevenson couldn't have said it any better when he talked about the guy that calls him up on the street, calls him up and said, how come I can't get a permit and draw in the lottery or whatever. I mean, you really need to understand that it does work that way, that the public talks to their legislators, and that public support that you enjoy in the department, in the legislature, or from a federal agency, from the Congress, is generated by that neighbor that you live next door to. It is critical to keep your budget. In good times, maybe not, doesn't make it maybe not much difference. But in bad times, the times we're living in today, it is paramount to keep your organization and get done what you need to get done. So you need to give your constituents, by the way, even who those are, what they want, and you need to do that in spades. You got to figure out how to be relevant, and you got to figure out how to be a good deal to the public, or else your political support's going to slip, your budgets will decline even further than they already are. There's not, we're not, as resource people, very competitive in the big scheme of things when you think about it. At the state level or at the federal level. We're really not. We like to think we are, but we're really not. So that has to be job one. Think about what you do every day and how you can, in fact, embrace political and public support. And if you're a good, effective leader, you can make that happen, and you can make a difference. I can tell you from my experience in Washington, it's true even at the state level, but in Washington, when I was director of BLM, I relied constantly on the goodwill generated by the field for both budget negotiations and for policy influence over policy decisions that being developed. And it's time and time again when you don't think about going in and seeing Senator Risch on some issue or Congressman Simpson or Senator Reid, when you don't have some dialogue about so-and-so back in my home district I was visiting with about this or that. It happens, it happened every time. There's always some connection to somebody back home, that even somebody like Senator Reid, the majority leader of the Senate, they stay connected, because obviously that's how they get elected. And so it makes a difference. And those relationships that you have as an individual are very, very important. So let me talk a minute about integrity. And integrity is like virginity. Once you lose it, you're not going to get it back. And, it's a guideline It's a benchmark, it's a point of reference. It can be used to make decisions, and it relies on something that's been mentioned, talked about, trust, and it relies on honesty. And the goodwill and the outgrowth of integrity can only be built over time and from the history of your words and your deeds. And again, it goes back to garnering that public support and then political support. So do what you say you will do. If you can't deliver, circle back and tell people why. Be a straight shooter. And you've heard this already. It's better to simplify the message than it is to complicate the message. Don't play games. Treat everyone fair and square. Show a concern for people. Science is important, the outcomes are important, the message is important, but you got to deliver it in a way they know that you're empathetic to their interests and their needs. You know, and the list can go on and on. Integrity is linked to your personal values and your principles. Bottom line is you have to be ethical to be an effective leader. Then there's another point in government that's particularly important here on the integrity side. You got to work the system. You have to do it honestly, up front, can't be under the table, behind the door, and behind some cloaked room somewhere. And you're going to get in trouble. But if you've got that bank account because you performed and acted that way all along, you can get by there. I mean, it's kind of like they talk about how many political chips, do they have to play in this particular negotiations. So don't be afraid of doing that. Our government was built to be slow and designed to be really inefficient. That's at best. At worst, it was built to be dysfunctional. And of course, right now, we're quite dysfunctional. But the point is that it's always better to provide that work the system, because that's what makes the government work long term. If you folks are working the system honestly, if you're self-starting, self-starters are a blessing. It's a lot better to have somebody as a supervisor you got to rein in than somebody that you got to kick in the behind to get them moving. So it's a valuable lesson to work the system, work it honestly, and expect to get in trouble. And if you have a good supervisor, they'll support you in that. Let's talk about credibility. Reputation, credibility. Pretty much in the eye of the beholder. It's how you act, behave, your ethics, your integrity. It's about your formal power and your informal power. As in your organization that you belong to, you have a certain amount of authority, et cetera, based on your position. As the director of BLM or as a forest supervisor, I had a lot of power and authority to make decisions, do this, do that. But at the same time, there's a lot of informal power that you possess. If you don't have it right now, you can get it. We all have the potential. It varies widely by individual, but it's there. And so here's some questions that you could ask yourself potentially for kind of establishing your take on what your credibility level is, what your pulse is. Do people seek you out for advice and counsel? Do they value your opinion? Do you shape decisions and actions that are really beyond your position? I'll give you an example of that. When I was in Washington, I was director of BLM, had nothing to do with ESA directly in terms of policy development, et cetera. But one of the things the secretary did was listed polar bears, right? And it was a mind-numbing, long-term discussion to get to that final decision. And rightly so, it was a very, very important decision. Do we or don't we? And it was based on science. It was driven by science. The outcome was science-based. That's why polar bears were ultimately listed. But we had many, 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 many hours of meetings about this listing decision that I was included in. And so that is the essence of this question, or this question. Do you shape, people seek you out, and do you help shape decisions that are really outside your formal position or authority? Are you looked at as a helpful partner, an ally in shaping decisions or getting things done? Do people seek your advice and review when selling new ideas? When crafting public messages? Goes back to what some of the other speakers talked about. What is the message that you're trying to get across, and who is your audience? Are you someone who helps reduce the complicated and make it more easily understood by others? This is the kind of thing, this is the stuff that makes you and your reputation and provides credibility. Your informal power and influence is really what sets you apart. And it's important that you have a good handle on and know yourself. You should know your strengths, and you should know your weaknesses, and how to minimize the weaknesses and maximize the strengths. So let me close with some advice. That other stuff is sort of philosophical in one sense. If you think about it, though, it's stuff you can relate to. It's stuff you can pinprick and put on and do on a daily basis. But here's some things maybe that will help out on a more practical level. And strengthen your effectiveness as a leader. And answer those questions. So understand and accept that science is just one of the many variables in resource policy development and decision making. Know your audience and your constituents. Speak to them in a way they understand. Think long-term. Science is a quest for long-term knowledge. Understand that it takes time for the public to catch on and catch up. Do not become an epic. Work towards the center, not on the fringes. And bring the public along with you. Most of the public really, truly is in the center somewhere. They're not out here. Be thoughtful about both the positive and negative effects of management decisions. Think about that, rather than just knee-jerk reaction to, this is against my interest as a scientist in my project, or what I know about this particular critter or that particular critter, what its needs are. Mentor your colleagues. Support your leadership. Artfully use the politics of no. And what I mean by that is, no, if we do X, it will have an impact on Y. And my research, says that clearly. But you got to be artful about how you make that connection. Artful about how you help the folks you're talking to in their interests be successful in this endeavor. They'll support that in the end. They'll come around in the end, but they've got to. Everybody learns differently. Everybody accepts things differently. So you have to be artful about how you do that. Work within the system we have to achieve positive, long-term, sustainable results. And when we need to be changed, things need to be changed, and they do need to be changed. Work in the same vein to make those changes. And above all else, at the end of the day, don't take yourself too seriously. Life's too short. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to dialogue with the rest of the panel and questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for the invitation to come and speak today. This is quite a great panel to be part of. And I think Dave intentionally asked us to speak to a few different questions, related questions, but slightly different towards our expertise. And he asked me to talk about some particular challenges that scientists face in communication and maybe some examples of good and bad communication. And so I've tried to kind of wrap that up into a few pointers. I can talk for days about communication, science communication. It's what I do and what I really enjoy. So it was hard to kind of pick the highlights to communicate today. And I did decide to use a PowerPoint, and I do hope that it supports and it doesn't detract. I think a lot of examples are visual, and so it's helpful, I think, to get to see what those are. So I'm going to just walk through communication from the audience point of view. What is it that happens with the public? And I'm generally talking about the general public, not as much some of the legislative and other audiences that you might be interacting with, but I'm going to focus primarily on the general public as an audience. Talk about some of the common pitfalls and challenges, and there are many challenges. I have some good examples of things that might seem rather subtle, but in fact have had some pretty dramatic effects in terms of public understanding of scientific concepts. And then I'm going to talk about a few tips for effective communication. I'm going to organize my comments around the process of communication that any communicator needs to consider, from the first step of attracting the audience's attention, which can often be a major impediment to getting a message across, to what happens when a person actually does attend to a message, and what happens in their mind when they think about and consider the arguments that you put forward. What effect does that have on their knowledge and understanding of an issue? Then beyond that, perhaps people understand an issue, but what impact might that have on their attitudes, their views about what ought to be done in terms of resource management? As some of the panelists have said, just the issue may not be understanding the science, it may be how that gets applied and what decisions get made in terms of management. And then the last step is behavior, and what happens between understanding and accepting a position and then actually acting on it. I'm not going to say much about the behavior step today because I'm taking our task as focused primarily on those first three steps. But I do want to point out that what's effective in science communication really depends on where you're at in the stage of this process. What is effective at capturing attention may be quite different from what's effective in causing someone to understand an issue, may be quite different from what causes someone to act on an issue. So if we start at the beginning of the process, attention is a very scarce, limited commodity, and seemingly increasingly so in our age of information overload. It's very difficult to attract the public's attention for a lot of issues. As Jim said, most of the publics may be in the middle, but they're also kind of apathetic about a lot of the issues that we're interested in as natural resource scientists. And you look at something like this and you say, okay, about how much time does an average viewer spend looking at a poster like this? A couple seconds? Pretty much no one is going to read all the way down to the final conclusions. And we really need to recognize that. Something that's as complicated as this, that deters people from paying any attention, is much less effective than something that is much, much simpler and makes only one or two points that somebody will actually attend to. So what does impact attention? Well, our attentional capacities are evolutionarily adapted to recognize things and tune to things that are novel, that are high contrast, and emotional. Probably resonates well with wildlife biologists, that humans' attentional capacities are primed that way. And we often don't take good advantage of that. A sign like this is extremely difficult for humans to orient towards. It doesn't have much in terms of novelty or contrast, and certainly not in emotion. Contrast that with this example. Landmines, a topic that might not be very captivating to many audiences paging through a magazine. What does this particular message do? It does a number of things. It draws on emotion, right? It has high contrast, foreground to background contrast. It uses information very, very judiciously. There's only 1 or 2 points made, but they're made in a powerful way. And it uses personalization, a specific person's name. All of these are good features to attract our attention. And we don't do it nearly enough as science communicators. In fact, this is what we tend to do, right? Our general public is going to engage with science at visitor centers and at Dworshak. Here, this particular example, how captivating is a title called The Management Puzzle? It just isn't. And you look at these great artwork that I'm sure somebody put a lot of work into, but it just doesn't really resonate with people. Or better yet, wildlife biologists, of course the most important thing to say about sheep is how big they are and how large their horns are, but this is probably not the kind of thing that's going to really resonate with the audience who wants to see, where can I go see the babies or whatever. And we need to be thinking about that audience and trying to design our communications to capture their attention. Denali National Park has figured this out. Their recent visitor center has really, really well-designed communications. Look at what's different about these. How about a headline that says, or a title that says, "Mosquitoes deserve your love"? Does that make you want to read it? Yeah, much more than biology or the management puzzle, right? Ground squirrels are fast food of the tundra. This links to the audience, creates sort of positive emotional reaction about the humor, resonates with fast food. They've really done a good job at designing their communications in ways that are going to draw in the audience. So we need to be thinking about this in the different venues where we are communicating, and what is it that we can do to capture and hold our audience's attention about things that fascinate us but might not fascinate them. Okay, so capturing attention is a huge problem, but it's certainly not the solution. Just because somebody pays attention to your message doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to process it. In fact, work that we've done at Yosemite suggests that all this work that they put into designing a bunch of new signs was rather ineffective. The average time that a visitor spent reading a sign at Yosemite is about 2.1 seconds. So most of the content on the signs is not getting processed. If it's not processed or considered, it doesn't impact cognition. The depth to which a person considers and thinks about a message is affected by a couple of things. One is how motivated they are to process that message. Is it something that's interesting to them, that they want to think about? And then, are they able to process it, given the context where they're engaging with it, or their technical abilities? Our panel has illustrated some examples already about language that we tend to use that may be a little opaque to our audiences. A few of the things that impact cognition are volitional, like my personal interest. I can decide I want to be interested in the material that's going to be on a test. But many of them are more innate to the way that we perceive and function and consider. And there are things that we can do as communicators to enhance the ability to process, like using visual and verbal overlap. So I'll give an example here. And using a couple of other techniques to overcome some of our cognitive limitations. So one thing is just to make it interesting. How can we make something interesting? Well, we've seen a couple of examples already, but using questions is very effective in communication. Humans like challenges, they like puzzles, and so questions as titles, questions as openers, setting something up as a puzzle is an effective way to draw in an audience. They want to get to the answer and figure it out. Using language or metaphors or human universal concepts like mystery and love and universal values is also effective. As scientists, we often shy away from this. We don't want to use these kind of evocative language, but it is effective at capturing the audience's attention, and it can be done in a way that doesn't detract from the scientific quality of the work. Make it easy to process. I mentioned visual verbal overlap. This is won a Clio Award, actually, and it's a commercial for Tide, and I think we can't read it, but it says something like the amount of energy saved by washing in cold water is enough to power the Empire State Building for a year, or something like that. So that visually sends the same message that the text presents. Also, very, very brief. One simple fact. They chose it very judiciously. It's probably a fact that you might remember, where you wouldn't remember facts that are buried in some long report. So we can do things to make people motivated to process our message, but even if people are motivated and they want to try to understand the issues, we have a number of kind of cognitive limitations that are challenging, particularly with the kind of science that you do that involves probabilistic information and risk information. This can be a real challenge, and a lot of good work done in the health arena about how to communicate things like health risks for people to make good informed decisions. One capacity that's difficult for people is spatial, and in this day and age with more and more spatial representations and maps, we have to be aware of this. I assume all of you know what that is a map of. When this was shown to visitors at an aquarium on the coast of Oregon, many visitors did not recognize that that is the western coast of North America. And in fact, they thought that it might be a bathymetric representation of the ocean. This map, which illustrates chlorophyll, was even more inscrutable. The majority of regular visitors, when shown this, asked to say, what does this mean to you, couldn't say what it meant. We have to just be aware of that because we're used to working in this kind of language and representation, but much of the public is not. So we need to think about different ways that we can present that information. Numeracy is an area that I'm really interested in. It's the equivalent of literacy. Turns out we're not very good at certain kinds of numerical calculations. In this particular study, they asked people a number of things. For example, which is smaller, the odds of 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10. Some of these people were able to answer pretty accurately, but I think that last one says, let's see if I can read it there. In the Acme Publishing sweepstakes, the chance of winning a car is 1 in 1,000. What percentage of tickets of Acme Publishing wins a car? 46% of people could get the right answer in one study, 24% in another study. That's rather sobering, I think. We're not particularly good at doing those kinds of calculations. Here another example in the health field. People were shown information about survival rates under some different treatments, and 74% of the people could determine the number of survivors, which is here on the y-axis. They could figure that out, but only about half could figure out the difference in chances of survival between two points in time. This is really troubling. And I would venture to guess that the same kinds of things happen when we talk to the public about science related to wildlife population survivals and so on. In this particular example, people were shown the information about tires and the odds of having a blowout per 5 million drivers. The odds under the improved tires are half of under the standard tires. They were shown this in either this graphical format or this numeric format, and it turns out that the format had a pretty dramatically different impact on people's understandings of these odds. In terms of the actual number of injuries, the actual value that was depicted here was 30. With the graphical representation, about 60% of people could remember that. Under the numerical, about 88%. So simply representing it graphically versus numerically had a dramatic impact on people's memory. Interestingly, less than half could even remember the base rate. This is a really common problem that we focus on the numerator and not the denominator. And so people will run out and say, yes, I'm going to buy these new improved tires, when they don't actually realize what the true magnitude of the risk is. It goes to show that you can represent the same information, it's exactly right, they're all scientifically accurate, can have really different effects on people's perceptions of risk and their concern, and then ultimately their behavior. A numerically identical risk framed as a gain versus a loss has a very different effect. Framing a treatment as having a 90% chance of survival, most people would choose the treatment. When framed as a 10% chance of death, most people decline treatment. Think about, I'm sure you can be thinking about sort of implications of what this might mean for, say, different kinds of restoration treatments, habitat treatments, and how you're going to frame the different potential outcomes. Some suggestions then, if you're going to be presenting this kind of information, using natural frequencies. People reason better with natural frequencies than percentages. Comparing to known quantities, something that people are familiar with, I'll show an example here in a minute, can help them sort of calibrate their sense of concern. Using both the numeric and the graphical formats is generally recommended, and using both gain and loss frames. So trying, at least in the health realm, trying to give people the most sort of balanced and holistic picture of the options that they face. So here's an example. Radon, bad stuff. We all know it's bad, right? And here's the number of extra deaths out of 1,000 people from some radon level. Radon's bad. What's the, anybody know what that EPA recommended threshold is? I hear one person knows this. So it goes to show that even as scientists, we're not all that up on very specifics. It is 4. So that's 20 deaths in 1,000. Is that a lot? Is it not very much?
That's a value.
Okay, you're right, it's a value judgment. Of course, we're making value judgments all the time in natural resource decisions, right? Is it a lot, is it not? Would you move out of the house? So what if we represent it this way? That's the equivalent of smoking 8 cigarettes a day. Does that kind of make you think about it a little bit differently? It did me the first time I saw this. All right, so we've been talking about influencing people's understanding of issues and scientific information. What about their attitudes about what ought to be done? The persuasion side of it. A number of things impact persuasion. Our panelists have been talking about messenger effects, and so I'm probably not going to say a lot more about that. But we am going to focus on a couple of things. The use of emotion and the impacts of framing and bias processing. We call it bias processing, but all processing is biased from a psychological point of view, as I'll show you here in a minute. So one thing to recognize is that often persuasion is more based on emotion or heuristics than it is on information. We sometimes think that knowledge is required for action or for voting or support. No, often it's not. People often act on the basis of a gut feeling or recommendation, word of mouth. Knowledge isn't always required, and even having knowledge doesn't necessarily mean people are going to act in a particular way. Lots of organizations know this and have picked up on it. We tend to shy away from using emotion in science communication, but at least we should be doing that with the recognition of you're out there competing with other messages that are using these effective kinds of techniques. It's important when you're designing your message that in addition to the arguments that you present about why something should or shouldn't be done, if that's the kind of message you're designing, that you pay attention to the other cues in the message. Who is the source? Is it a credible source? Sometimes the most credible source isn't a scientist. What other kinds of cognitive shortcuts are people using because they don't want to sit and read through your entire message? So all of the elements from graphic design to argument quality need attention, and if they're not in alignment, it can be much less effective. One important peripheral cue is, or heuristic is, we believe the messages from people that we like. John Stewart is a much more effective science communicator than I and probably most of us in this room are. And that's an interesting sort of thing to think about in this day of more and more sort of divisive and specialized media, how that message is getting translated between the science that you do in your lab and out to the public. And if people have questions about that, we can talk about it more. Using a credible source, so having Warren Miller out there talking about climate change is probably more effective with a certain demographic than having Al Gore. And maybe we should have partnerships to enlist good, credible sources to help us get our message across. We have to be aware that people, particularly people who have strong attitudes, are very, very difficult to sway. And we engage in a process of counter-argument. Some of you, when you look at this particular graphic, which talks about how states that use more coal to generate electricity have lower electricity rates, maybe some of you say, oh yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe some of you, all of a sudden you're like, well, wait, what are they not telling us? What's wrong with this argument? We naturally go through this process of either bolstering or counter-arguing messages, depending on how consistent they are with our pre-existing attitudes. And a particularly good example of this was recently done looking at climate change with visitors to the mall in Washington, D.C. And the researchers wrote up this nice one-page, well, I thought it was good, essay on the public health impacts of climate change. They thought, okay, we're gonna frame this message in a way that should resonate with the public health. So incidents of heat-related illness and fatalities, disease vectors, and so on. They wrote up this one-page essay. They walked around on the mall and they asked people to read it and to highlight sentences that they thought were particularly good and compelling and ones that they thought were not compelling. And before they did that, they had profiled people on their views about climate change according to a kind of a common, in the science common world these days, the 6 Americas, from the folks who tend to be really on board, think climate change is pressing, we're really alarmed, need to do something about it, to folks who are on the very dismissive end. And the circles here represent the size of the American public in each of these 6 Americas. So they profiled these folks and they had them read this essay. And what this shows in lots of complex, poor science communication visuals is how people reacted to the individual sentences. I'll just walk you through it. Each of these points on the x-axis is one of the sentences in the essay from these different parts of the essay. And on this side we have the believers, from the alarmed to the cautious. And on this side we have the unbelievers for the dismissives here. And this shows simply the level of agreement or how good they thought each sentence was. So you can see the alarmed folks, they read this sentence over here, whatever it was, and they said, yeah, that's right on, I totally agree with that, And the dismissive folks said, no, that's a really biased, uncompelling argument. So they're reading exactly the same information and processing it in diametrically opposed ways. There are some places where there was a bit more agreement. Whatever was said around this point seemed compelling to both groups. So maybe that's a place to be developing arguments if you're interested in getting people concerned about climate change and doing something about it. But it just reinforces how important it is to know your audience and to remember that just because you put the science out there doesn't mean people are going to interpret it the same way. And in fact, when asked why they graded different sentences different ways, people would say, well, it reflects my own personal point of view. The alarmed folks naturally would say that because it was a climate change is happening essay. Whereas the dismissive folks said, this is a biased presentation, it's not good science. So what are some general lessons and then a few tips? Well, one is realize that it's not just about people understanding the science. I think John started out saying it's not just this deficit model that people don't know the facts, and if they just know the facts, they'll end up in the right place. That's not what it's about when we're talking science communication. Realize that one size doesn't fit all, and what is going to be interesting to one audience and compelling to one audience may not be, probably won't be to another audience. Of course, then begs the question of how do you find out all these things you need to know about your audience before you develop your message. And realize that knowledge and action aren't necessarily connected, so that people may act on the basis of emotion and heuristic reasoning, or on the basis of factual knowledge. So what are some tips for you to take away? Well, capturing attention is really key in a lot of venues and a lot of contexts, even apparently in the legislative context. They aren't going to read your report, they're going to read the executive summary. So keeping it simple, high contrast, and really paying attention to design elements. Even in a scientific report, design elements can help or really hinder communication effectiveness. So work with a designer there. Address the limits of numeracy if that's appropriate in your particular context through the use of visuals and examples. I like this particular example from Grand Canyon. Instead of saying 0.00000% of people get injured and evacuated from the Grand Canyon, instead they said 250 people a year. They are deliberately trying to make people take this risk seriously. It's the same information whether it's framed as 0.00001% or 250 people, but it's more powerful to the audience using this particular framing. They use high color, and notice the picture that they use. They know their demographic, and they know that people tend to deny risk to self, so they say, most of the people look like him. Use techniques to circumvent resistance and defense motivation. Often we're dealing with audiences that either don't know much or are open-minded. They do respect scientists, so sometimes we're in a good communication place. But sometimes we are talking to audiences that don't agree with us. And there are techniques out there for how to address audiences that are resisting persuasion. They know you're trying to change their mind and they're doing everything they can to not be persuaded. It's difficult. I know sometimes we kind of disparage the public as being ignorant, but techniques that validate their concerns, that acknowledge that they have different values, that are legitimate, that they have their own personal knowledge, those kinds of techniques can go a long way towards building trust. Recognizing that what you're suggesting may not be the most palatable to all audiences is also an effective technique. Listerine uses this technique. I don't know if you've seen any of the commercials where people are making horrible faces because they know it tastes bad. They're deliberately using this technique of inoculation and validation, saying, we know that Listerine doesn't taste good, we're not going to lie to you and say it does, but it's really effective. Domino's Pizza did this a couple of years ago with the cardboard campaign. I don't know if people saw any of the ads where they talked about how they would recognize that their pizza tasted like cardboard and they're changing it. So it seems like a really counterintuitive kind of strategy, but it can be effective if you know your audience is defense motivated. Choose your framing carefully. In a fairly recent study, different people were asked about their willingness to accept a carbon emissions fee for airline tickets. And among the Republicans in the audience, when it was framed as carbon offset, 65% said they would support it. When it was framed as a carbon tax, 27% supported it. One word different. It's pretty sobering. Salt Lake City provides a really good example, I think. The mayor of Salt Lake City was a Democrat a number of years ago, I don't know who he is now, but he wanted to implement energy-saving strategies in city government. How did he sell it? He didn't sell it as environment. He sold it as saves money, good for old people's health, air quality. And it worked. Got an electric fleet and a number of different actions taken there. So think about your framing. It really does make a difference. Resonating with your audience's values, as I just said with the Salt Lake City example, but here's one of two stories from the BBC on my homepage. This one talking about alpine glaciers in retreat, all kind of sciencey stuff. There's nothing in there about tourism, nothing about recreation, nothing that's going to resonate with a lot of audiences' values. On the other hand, another story might actually capture the audience attention, people who care about the economics of it. Climate scientists, next slide. Developing your strong arguments, emphasizing the majority, as a couple of panelists have said, most people do trust scientists, and reminding us that sometimes the loud voices that get heard a lot are on the fringe. Al Gore's We campaign was trying to do this by illustrating how opposites, people from different sides of the spectrum, they had Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich up there all saying, we are behind this climate campaign, trying to emphasize that most people are concerned. And climate scientists have been trying to use some of these kinds of techniques to resonate with their audiences. This is out of some of the climate work at Yale and George Mason, who have, by the way, some really, really outstanding science communication examples and materials. So in conclusion then, science communication is challenging. There's lots of different things to consider at all steps in this process. It's really fun, I think, but it's challenging. And fortunately, there are a lot of tools and resources out there. This has gotten a lot of additional recognition recently. There's tools like Climate Wise, Psychology, Climate Communication, the work that folks at Yale are doing, George Mason. Those relate to climate change in particular, but there are a lot of other resources out there for science communication with more advice and tips about what is effective. So with that, thank you.
We're going to open up now for a panel discussion and give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. I'm going to start it off with some seed questions from somebody that will not throw any softballs. Dr. Michael Scott, if I can give it to him, and then from then on, we will open it up for other folks.
Thank you, David. I was struck by a comment that John Freeman made, and then a comment that Bert Stevenson made. And they stood, in my mind at least, in stark contrast to each other. And John made the comment that 70% of the Idaho public supported the reintroduction of wolves to Idaho. But Bert, you indicated that the wolf issue was the most contentious issue during your 14 years of service as chair of the Natural Resources Committee. And we all know that to be true because it was on the headlines every day. Those two facts seem to go against each other. With 70% of the public supporting the action, why was there such controversy within the legislature?
Well,
And how did we fail as scientists in terms of providing you the information you needed to maybe resolve the issue?
one of the things that I think you need to realize that as legislators, we're more sensitive to the people in our district that talk to us about issues. And normally the people that fill out the questionnaire, the survey, will not talk to legislators about their feelings. But we do hear from those people who are in the wolf case, who were opposed to it. And so that's where our information comes from. Now, it has nothing to do with science. The other thing on the wolf issue that made it so contentious for so long was the fact that when they reintroduced the wolves, we were promised, I'm not sure I should use the word promise, it was intimated. I probably should turn this one over to Jim.
For the recovery goal.
Okay, the recovery, they were supposed to be recovered when the wolves, when we had 10 packs and 150, or 10 breeding pairs and 150 wolves. Well, man, they just kept moving that post and saying, well, we got to have this and got to have that. Had the scientists and the people that was anxious to reintroduce them, my perspective, probably Fish and Wildlife Service, had they come and say, we've reached that, now we'll help to get them delisted, would have gone a long ways to resolve that particular issue. Back to your original question, it's the people who talk to their legislators are the ones that are heard, not particularly the surveys that are done.
Nancy, you were on the commission at that time. How did it play out in your arena?
When I was on the commission, we were not allowed to say the word wolf by statute.
Mr. Scott, that was one of, you think the legislature don't make errors. Let me tell you, that was one of the biggest errors that the legislature made when they passed legislation, and I think that was in '95, just at the time they reintroduced them. Some people had the feeling that if we forbid the fish and game to get involved with them, they won't. They're going. And then, of course, Farm Bureau was trying to, with the lawsuit, and that doesn't happen. What you don't want to do when you have this kind of a reintroduction of a species, you don't want to let your managers rid them to be participation. What happened when it came time for them to get re-engaged in it? They hadn't been allowed to connect the data. They didn't have their own database, so they had to rely on other people's.
It's a result of the legislature's decision to, make it impossible for the State Fish and Game Department to be involved. I, at the time, was with the Cooperative Research Unit and was offered the research contract to study wolves. I turned it down because it was a conflict of interest between the interests of the Fish and Game Department and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I passed on the ability to do that research and went over to the tribe. But Jim, I mean, that was sort of, you were active then. How did it play out in your camp?
Well, we could talk about wolves. I mean, that was the fundamental difference, I think, between, I shouldn't say difference, it was the fundamental function of the Office of Species Conservation under the governor's office to work on those policy issues. And, OSC is not an implementation group, it's a policy group. And so initially there was a lot of angst about that whole thing, and there was all this business going on and dust up about trying to take away authority from the Fish and Game and assuming power and all this kind of business. But at the end of the day, I think we forged a very, very, very healthy working relationship. And so I would trot over to the Fish and Game on almost a daily basis and talk with them about, the biology and the this and the that, and then I could speak to that in the legislature. I could lead, if you will, on behest of the governor and the governor's office. And so it was.
So you were sort of serving as a translator for the science as well as to the governor's office and the legislature both.
Right. I mean, we were the ones. The department finally would end up getting involved in the numbers to some degree, and they could testify on some of that stuff later on, but initially we were the only real connection to that side of the equation. In fact, I gotta tell a story here about the chairman. This guy's a real statesman, and the legislature in the state of Idaho lost really good legislator when he decided to not run last time. And as chairman, I'll never forget, we were deep into the negotiations and the development of an MOU with the tribe. Now this is later in the process when it looked like, finally we'd get around to the department assuming control again, and eventually we're going to get delisted. And in fact, we were working on the new 10J rule. We started out with the original rule that allowed them to be reintroduced, but then later on that rule got modified and we had a little more flexibility. And we spent a couple of years negotiating with the tribe on how we were going to make this transition and all the details, and we developed this MOU. And of course that wasn't a very popular idea, particularly among some legislators and some constituent groups. But anyway, I was testifying one day with the chairman and his committee. And one of the legislators was so frustrated with this and so ticked off. And she was sitting there and she had this pencil and she was doing this, and finally it just flipped out of her hand and it comes singing across the table and just clipped my ear. And she didn't do that on purpose, it just kind of slipped out of her hand, But the chairman, he saved my life that day, so otherwise I probably would have been impinged.
But let me tell you the rest of the story. I could see that something was happening because of the whispering and things that were going on around the committee. I knew that something was happening, and one of the good legislators from the other party, I leaned over and I said, "Is there a motion coming?" And he says, "I think so." And I adjourned the meeting. And the motion that was going to be made was that we were not going to accept the 10J rule and forbid the Office of Species Conservation any longer be involved with the wolves. I knew that there was something coming, and it seemed prudent to adjourn the meeting rather than to get that kind of a motion on the table after the meeting.
Well,
But Jim was a great man.
it's been 20-plus years since they established the Senate, but I don't believe another state has anything similar. Could you talk a little bit about how that increases the exchange of science across the science policy divide?
You mean OSC?
Yeah, OSD, Office of Species Conservation.
Well, it is a statute, obviously. It was passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, and that goes back to Kinflin days. So it would have been in 2000 when it was created. And it is a policy office. It's got some very specific laws and very specific objectives. And one of which is to bridge the gap, to be the mouthpiece, if you will, for the governor to help, some states are organized so that all the resource agencies are in kind of one department, and then they have sort of subsections, for water and wildlife and fish and da-da-da-da. We're not. We have equal directorships, if you will, in the state. So, all our resource agencies in the state of Idaho are separate. And it's difficult to get Virgil to talk to, the director of parks. They run in different circles, they have different issues that they're dealing with on a daily basis, and so to come to some common understanding on a resource question, particularly focused on ESA, is really tough to do. There's no real forum for that. And they're all equal. And who's going to step out and say, well, follow me, I'm in charge, and we'll all get together? Something's got to make that happen. And so that is really one of the key roles that OSD played, at least during my tenure. And then to talk to the feds. That's the other thing. The interface with the federal government and Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service, over listed species. And then the ability to develop state plans. That's the other key thing. And that doesn't happen too often because you don't delist very often. But develop state plans as to how we're going to manage the species once it comes back under state control. And there's another story about this guy, is that we developed a grizzly bear management plan. Brad was involved in that. We had a fairly broad base of folks. At the time, Steve Huffaker was director, and Steve personally dealt with the development of that. We jointly did that together, and we had this little consensus group. We were based out of course, eastern Idaho. And we wrote this plan, and there's some science in there, and there's a lot of practical how-to stuff. And then we were on the stump to sell this, and it had to be approved by the legislature. The law says that. And so the chairman set up a subcommittee to review, because it's a fairly detailed document, to review this document. And Brad and I were the ones that were kind of on the stump there to present this, and we had these multiple meetings, and so they were just nitpicking the language. And they were making lots of changes, and changes that weren't necessarily very helpful to the long-term ability to manage the critter if it went off the list. And then we had some people on the group that had crafted this, that had spilled blood over it to get it done and agreed to it. Now they see their words being changed. And so there was some rioting going on amongst the troops here. And some non-support that we had originally that was melting away, which wasn't a good thing either. Well, it had to go to the full committee. So it came from the subcommittee with all these suggested changes in the full committee. And the chairman was able to finesse every change and get it passed through the committee and onto the floor and get it passed and get it signed into law, get it approved, not signed into law, get it approved through the legislature. And every one of those changes, my recommendation as I presented it to the hearing, was to go back to the original language. And I had a rationale for each one of those changes, and we did. And he made that happen. And he got enough support out of his committee, got it passed, and got it on the floor, and worked it through the floor, and got it passed. And without that, we wouldn't have had that document. We wouldn't have had the kind of support that it ended up having at the end of the day. You know, the folks that were affected by it and the constituencies tonight. Now, you know, it's still on the list because of the courts and all those other things on the federal side, but that doesn't take away from the good work that was done by the state. So that's the kind of stuff.
So what you're saying is, at the end of the day, your relationship with the chairman was really key to making it happen.
Oh, of course.
I can tell you that the chairman didn't have anything to do with that. This was the people that had worked and pulled it together and brought a credible program. The chairman just happened to get it on the docket and right order.
What they had come up with was a document that, from your point of view, was policy and management relevant and would get the job done.
And the other thing that Idaho did, from my perspective, was that when we created the Office of Species Conservation, there was one place then that would speak for the state and would deal with the federal government. And those were two hugely important issues, because we had so many people speaking for the state up till then. And Jim did a super job there too, I think.
Which raises a question. I think one of the most difficult things I had to deal with in my career was the issue of making sure that the questions, because I was a public employee, that the questions I were asking were management and policy relevant. And I guess I'd start with you, Troy, but it's a question for all of you, is how can we do a better job of creating the partnerships between the scientists, the researchers, and the folks that are actually doing the work on the ground? How can we create forums where researchers and managers can come together to work together to identify what the questions are and how to go about conducting them? Troy?
It's a really good question, and it's really challenging. I was reflecting on a national conference I was involved with that was trying to bring managers and scientists together, and it didn't work particularly well. And I think partly it's a language thing, partly it's not knowing each other's sort of needs and interests, maybe even knowing each other's practical constraints. It seems to me the best examples are where we on the scientific side are more proactive when we're going forward, thinking about what a potential research project would be. I mean, I'm a social scientist, so I can only speak to the kind of science I do, but all of my science that's funded by the Park Service or Forest Service, whatever, has that applied piece and a basic piece. And I do that, and I have really strong relationships with agency folks. I guess on the academic side, we don't reward that type of outreach nearly enough. You know, it's not what gets you tenure to be out doing workshops with agency folks. So I guess I don't have a really good answer to that. I think it comes down to some structural and systematic kinds of constraints, but then also sort of the personal commitment and motivation to do it.
Mike, I picked up that I saw it a lot
In chairing the BLM Science Board, just the difference between how managers and scientists look at various things in the world. And I'm real interested, when Troy just said they tried a conference and it didn't work so well. I mean, that's a side conversation two of us have had, but I've noticed they do need to be in the same room, but they need to explain where they're coming from and why managers. Jim tried to do it up here. The kind of things that a BLM director or whoever it might be have to consider when they make a decision and why, but they don't, and this is not a comment on Jim, sometimes managers don't do a good job conveying to scientists how they're not able to use the science the way the scientists think they should because of other reasons. Likewise, it works the other way, all right? Scientists need to convey to managers more effectively the way they look at things and get a dialogue going. I think a lot of times, right, they go to different conferences. They're stovepiped in different worlds, and there's not a place for them to just share the way they do things with each other, all right? And it might be also deep down into the way they see the world, which goes way beyond how you fix that. I mean, you know, the joke in the university is that the administrators are the clown academics who couldn't do anything right, so they went into administration to make the big bucks. I don't think that's true in federal lands by any stretch of that, but there may be some of that going on too, but they don't often get together and just talk about, here's how I have to make a decision and why, or here's why I think the science is important and why.
How would you
One
change that?
one other thing there, and you know this very well, how often do we get approached by managers who say, I got this problem, science, tell me how to fix it. I need to decide to issue special use permits, or I need to make some decision. And maybe we aren't as good at communicating what it is that we can provide that is decision relevant. And sometimes managers want us to make the decision because it takes the hard problems out of their hands. And I think we've got to be better on both sides of communicating what we can and where our domains of responsibility are. You want to speak to that question?
No, I just have a separate question, maybe for the entire panel, but what extent you could answer scientists, if you go the length to try and message and be clear and concise and really work towards the messaging side of things that we talked about, how in danger or how is that perceived in terms of advocating? And instead you should be delivering a dry and boring and non-message material so that you're not an advocate. And how do you figure that out?
I was expecting somebody to ask that question, actually. I think we can. I think some of the examples that I showed illustrate how it's the same facts, right? And we can do a good job about communicating facts. The panel has said you shouldn't be advocating for a particular policy position. I don't know where individuals in this audience come down on that, but I think we can do a much better job of crafting our science, just the science piece of it, in a way that gets the point across. I mean, so much science communication is so bad that I think there's lots of room for improvement without having that concern of crossing over where that boundary might be for a particular individual. I think we can. I mean, yeah, I do. I guess, and there are places, I guess you could say, wow, if I'm going to try to use anthropomorphism or emotional kinds of arguments, I think some scientists are going to be really uncomfortable going that far. But I still think there are things that we can do in terms of clarity and presentation.
So, I think one, just to continue, if I'm talking to the knuckle dragger who we saw was up there at the podium earlier, and my fact is there's 90% chance that we want this to happen, or this is the 90 percentile going this way, as opposed to the 10% fail. And if it's the knuckle dragger is on one side, then the knuckle dragger might perceive it too. The answer is, well, if that's adverse to my position in my context, I perceive you as advocating 90 and not the 10.
I'm not sure I got you.
Okay? In the context of a statistical, and there's a 90% probability that this will occur, and you can present that in the context of messaging, rather than saying, as was brought up earlier, 10% chance that there's a fail. That might be perceived if it's adverse to a position or policy, that that's actually advocating a change as opposed to just the facts.
But I think that happens all the time, of course. But I think that's where we have the responsibility to say, I do survey work, for example, and I say 75% of the people support option X. It's your job, manager, to decide, do you want to use a democracy rule that anything over 50%? Or do you want to say, I'm going to manage for the 1% of people who feel this way, or I'm going to manage for people who are informed on it. And we just, I get in this situation all the time with my survey work, and I say, look, that's your decision about which option you want to implement, and I need to be as upfront and honest as I can be about, if you adopt this, here's what I think will happen. If you adopt this alternative, here's what I think will happen. Here's my certainty or uncertainty associated with that, and just keep, make that clear. But you're right. I mean, people are afraid of messages that they think are going to threaten them, as factual and unbiased as they might be. And we just have to be alert to that. I don't think it can let us shy away from being active participants.
I agree. I had another thought, though, back to the other question. That it seems to me like the majority of the time where you get this really good, strong interaction between the management side, if you will, and the scientific side is displayed when we have, like the Grizzly Bear Committee, Interagency Grizzly Bear, which has been around now for 25 years or 30 years, whatever it's been. Now, in that forum, the decisions about what to do with bears, where, when, why, how, and all this research side and all this other stuff goes on in a situation where you have science and management that come together. Everybody's represented across all of the interests, the agency interests that have this responsibility, and they come out with some kind of a decision to do X. And the science is very, very heavily weighed. We don't do that, though, and that's in the context, of course, of an ESA listed species and all of those things. We don't do that, though, when we're doing the day-to-day stuff. And it seems like we could use the model a lot better. And I know it's a burden on people, and it's the more work and da-da-da-da-da, but it seems like if we were surgical about this and thought about where we have activity going on that would benefit from that kind of a model, we could put something like that in place, and we could make a lot better decisions on the ground. Maybe restoration, big restoration proposals might be one of those kinds of places where we're going to pour a significant amount of money into a big project that covers thousands of acres. Maybe we ought to be looking at it from that particular point of view and not just a carte blanche, everybody's got to do this.
Okay, following up on that.
Mike, I have an example that just one example, but last fall, I'm part of a team that is funded by the National Science Foundation, a group of students and faculty at the University of Idaho, and the students are working on climate change in the Northern Rockies and a new downscale model. And what we did was, from the outset, we said we want to make this relevant, and so we held 4 day-long workshops in November, and we got about 150, mostly agency folks there, where the students presented climate science. We had opportunities for dialogue among the participants and with the scientists. They generated a list of sort of questions and gaps for our team. I think it was fairly successful. We had good attendance and minimal effort took a day of people's time, basically. It took a couple of weeks of our time at the workshops. But I think it was one of the sort of new models of trying to find some kind of forum where we can have really effective and strategic, useful dialogue between science and management community.
And there are a couple of examples on the sage grouse where folks from different agencies work together, they're incredibly effective. There are a couple of questions from the audience, but I guess I'd like to put Jim Unsworth, because he's right in front of me here, on the spot and ask him how he sees it from his chair, in terms of how we bring researchers and managers together more effectively.
I don't know about that question, but I have some other questions. And this has really been a fascinating morning. I've been really thoroughly enjoying it. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the biological part of these questions is usually pretty simple. From a wolf management standpoint, biologically, it's a pretty simple critter, for the most part. have had a lot of arguments among the peers. And I really liked how your comments, Nancy, how your peers paint the spectrum of people and how your message is accepted or not. I thought that was really a good comment. But the one part I think would be interesting, or my question is, how has the legal system and the courts, how do they inform or detract from these kind of resource policy questions? Sometimes it seems like we can almost get there, or we can't even get there, just hashing things out, and then a monkey wrench gets thrown in this box in the form of some kind of legal question. So I'd like to maybe have a couple of you talk about how do you think the courts interact, and is it just a delay, or is it useful?
Sucks. It's a forum, it's a game in a sense, and there are, as some of you well know, the courts are designed in sort of to ensure fairness and the law being followed, but they're also, the way some of these resource laws have been created, they become another fora to win what you could not win elsewhere. You remember what happened with the wolf finally when Fish and Wildlife wanted to delist it, and they got agreement, many environmental groups went on, but it took two to bring a lawsuit, and finally what did Mike Simpson have to do? He got a writer on a bill. That's politics as its function, but the courts, some people have proposed, for example, and this is only part of the problem, we've created an incentive to sue for some groups because they can get essentially all their costs covered if they win. That was usually